When a white officer decides to humiliate an elderly blind woman and breaks her cane in the park, he has no idea what consequences await him. This case will turn the lives of many upside down, and justice will come in unexpected ways. Subscribe and be sure to share your opinion in the comments. Where are you watching this from? Morning was a sacred time for Grace Hollis. The stillness of dawn, broken only by the subtle sounds of life stirring to wakefulness, was a symphony that she relished. Grace couldn't see the sunlight spilling over the treetops or the faint mist clinging to the ground, but she felt it in the cool air that kissed her skin and the sense of dew-drenched grass wafting through her open window. Her world was a canvas painted with sounds, scents, and textures. This was her reality, and she had learned to embrace it. At 73 years old, Grace had developed a routine that offered her both comfort and independence. She lived alone in a small house at the edge of Rosewood Park, a lush expanse of greenery that stretched across the heart of the town. Each day began with the familiar ritual of brewing tea, the sharp whistle of the kettle marking the transition from night to day. The feel of the warm ceramic cup in her hands grounded her, a tangible reminder of the life she had built despite the challenges that came with her blindness. This morning was no different. As she carefully folded her scarf over her shoulders, Grace's fingers brushed against the polished handle of her white cane. It was a loyal companion, worn but sturdy, a testament to her resilience. She traced the smooth surface absent-mindedly, a small smile playing on her lips. Outside, the distant chirping of birds and the faint hum of car engines signaled that the world was waking up. The path to the park was a familiar one, each step marked by mental landmarks she had committed to memory long ago. The uneven edge of the sidewalk near the corner store, the gentle slope that led to the main park entrance, and the creak of the old iron gate. It was a map she carried within her. Today, as always, she walked with purpose, her cane tapping lightly against the pavement in rhythm with her steady footsteps. The park welcomed her with the rustle of leaves and the faint aroma of blooming flowers. It was a living, breathing entity that Grace had come to know intimately over the years. The bridge that arched over the shallow creek, the bench beneath the sprawling oak tree, the vendor cart where James, a college student working part-time, sold coffee. Each detail of the park had its place in her mental landscape. She often imagined its colors and textures, piecing together fragments of her past-sighted world with the rich tapestry of her other senses. Grace's route rarely varied. She began at the entrance, letting the gentle slope guide her toward the bridge. The sound of rushing water beneath the planks comforted her. It was a small victory to navigate the park on her own terms, a reminder that her blindness did not define her. Today, the park seemed quieter than usual, though she could hear the distant laughter of children playing by the swings. The air was cooler, carrying the crispness of early autumn. As she approached the bench near the oak tree, she heard the faint crunch of boots against gravel. The sound was distinct, purposeful, and unfamiliar. Grace paused, her cane hovering above the ground. She turned her head slightly, her ears straining to place the noise. A man's voice, gruff and impatient, interrupted her thoughts. "Morning," he said, his tone curt. "You all right, ma'am?" Grace's grip on her cane tightened. There was something in his voice, a sharpness, a layer of suspicion that made her uneasy. She nodded politely, her own voice steady. "Good morning. I'm just out for a walk." The man didn't respond immediately. She heard the faint shuffle of his boots as he shifted his weight. "You're walking alone? Blind, I take it?" The question was blunt, devoid of any real concern. Grace raised her chin slightly, a habit she'd developed over the years when confronted with condescension. "I've been walking this path for years. I know it well." The silence that followed was heavy. Grace could feel his gaze on her, though she couldn't see the way his eyes narrowed with judgment. Finally, he spoke again, his voice carrying a note of skepticism. "Be careful. It's not always safe out here." She nodded once more, offering a polite but firm "Thank you for your concern," before continuing her walk. Her cane tapped rhythmically against the path, its sound a reassurance that she was in control. As she moved farther away, the man remained rooted in place, his eyes following her figure until she disappeared from view. Officer Miles Randy wasn't used to being ignored. He was accustomed to authority, to people reacting to his presence with deference or fear. The old woman's calm dismissal grated on him in a way he couldn't quite place. Grace, oblivious to the storm brewing behind her, continued her walk. She stopped briefly at James's coffee cart, exchanging pleasantries with the young vendor who always greeted her warmly. His voice was a welcome contrast to the gruffness of the man she'd just encountered. With a steaming cup of tea in hand, she found her way to her usual bench, settling in with a contented sigh. The park was her sanctuary, a place where she felt free. But today, a shadow lingered at the edges of her thoughts, a faint unease she couldn't shake. She brushed it aside, attributing it to the abruptness of the stranger. Grace was no stranger to prejudice, but she refused to let it define her day. As the morning stretched into noon, she rose from the bench, ready to make her way home. The park, with its familiar sounds and textures, had given her the peace she sought. But as she exited through the creaking gate, the faint echo of the man's voice lingered in her mind, a prelude to the trials that lay ahead. The next morning began as any other for Grace. She brewed her tea, its aroma filling the small, cozy confines of her home. The steam, curling from the cup, seemed to carry away the faint unease from the previous day. Her routine was a shield, a reassurance that her independence remained intact. Yet, as she stepped out of her house and onto the familiar path to the park, there was a slight hesitation in her movements, a trace of caution born from the gruff encounter she hadn't quite been able to forget. The park greeted her with its usual symphony, the distant rustle of leaves, birds chirping in the treetops, and the occasional murmur of passing voices. Grace inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air invigorate her. Today, she decided, would be no different from any other. She wouldn't let the memory of an unpleasant interaction taint her sanctuary. As her cane tapped rhythmically along the paved path, Grace became immersed in the comforting rhythm of her walk. She made her way toward the bench beneath the oak tree, where she often paused to enjoy the cool shade. The park felt busier today. The laughter of children playing on the swings and the chatter of young couples echoed in the distance, mingling with the occasional bark of a dog. Grace reached her bench and settled down, savoring the peace. Her fingers traced the worn wood of the bench, a tactile reassurance of her place in this space. She adjusted the scarf around her neck and leaned back, letting the sounds of the park envelop her. But then she heard it, the deliberate crunch of boots on gravel. Her body tensed involuntarily as the sound grew closer, each step heavy with purpose. A familiar voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "Well, if it isn't the park's most determined visitor." Grace recognized the voice immediately. It was the same man as the day before, his tone carrying the same edge of condescension. She straightened, gripping her cane more tightly. "Good morning," she replied evenly, masking the unease that was beginning to coil in her chest. Officer Miles Randy loomed over her, his imposing frame casting a shadow she could feel more than see. "I see you're back at it. Brave, I'll give you that," he said, the faintest smirk curling his lips. "You always walk alone?" Grace kept her voice calm, though her pulse quickened. "Yes, I've been walking here for years. It's a beautiful park." Randy chuckled, the sound low and almost menacing. "Beautiful, sure, but not always safe. You know, people like you should think twice about wandering around without someone to watch out for them." Grace frowned, a flicker of defiance sparking within her. "I manage just fine on my own." The words seemed to irritate him. His tone shifted, losing its feigned friendliness. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? Walking around like you own the place. Cane or no cane, you're just asking for trouble." The tension in the air was palpable. Grace stood, steadying herself with her cane. "I don't believe we've been introduced. If you're an officer, I assume you're here to ensure everyone's safety, not to intimidate them." Her words were measured, but they carried a quiet strength that seemed to further inflame Randy's temper. He stepped closer, his boots crunching loudly against the gravel. "Don't get smart with me, lady. You think your little stick makes you untouchable? Let me show you just how fragile your independence really is." Before Grace could react, she felt a sudden, violent tug. The cane was wrenched from her hands, leaving her momentarily disoriented. She stumbled back, her heart pounding. The sound of the cane snapping in two was deafening in the silence that followed. Grace's breath caught, her world suddenly unmoored. The voices of nearby park-goers grew hushed, their murmurs a distant backdrop to the ringing in her ears. Randy tossed the broken pieces of the cane at her feet, his voice cold and dismissive. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before mouthing off." Grace bent slowly, her fingers trembling as they searched for the shattered remnants of her cane. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, the mixture of pity and discomfort radiating from the onlookers. No one intervened. No one challenged the officer. The humiliation burned hotter than her anger. She straightened, clutching the broken pieces to her chest. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady. "You've done your worst, officer. I hope it gives you the satisfaction you were looking for." With those words, she turned and began the arduous task of navigating the park without her cane. Each step was a struggle, her hands reaching out to find familiar textures and landmarks. The world felt hostile now, the safety of the park shattered along with her cane. The sound of Randy's boots retreating was a cruel echo in her ears. She heard his voice, low and mocking, fading into the distance as he walked away. "Good luck out there, ma'am." Grace's journey home was slow and painful. Every step felt like a battle, her once unshakable confidence eroded by the morning's events. By the time she reached her front door, her hands were raw from gripping fences and walls for support. She stepped inside, shutting the door behind her and leaning against it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She clutched the broken cane tighter, her knuckles whitening. For the first time in years, Grace Hollis felt small, powerless in a world that seemed intent on reminding her of her vulnerability. The broken cane lay across Grace's lap as she sat in her favorite armchair, her fingers tracing the jagged edges where it had snapped in two. The afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, painting the walls in soft, warm hues, but its warmth seemed distant, unreachable. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in around her, the silence heavy and oppressive. She replayed the morning's events in her mind, each moment etched with painful clarity. The coldness in Officer Randy's voice, the snap of the cane, the indifference of the bystanders. It wasn't the first time Grace had encountered prejudice. She had faced her share of judgment and patronizing attitudes since losing her sight. But this was different. This was violence, pure and raw, an attempt to strip her of her independence and dignity. A tear slipped down her cheek and she hastily brushed it away, anger bubbling beneath the surface. She wouldn't let him see her cry. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction, even in the privacy of her own home. But it hurt. Oh, how it hurt. A knock at the door broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. She hesitated, wiping her face with her sleeve before carefully rising from her chair. Her fingers brushed against the wall, guiding her to the door. She opened it slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mom?" A familiar voice called softly, filled with concern. Grace's shoulders relaxed as she recognized her son's voice. "Marky?" she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. Relief washed over her as she stepped aside to let him in. Marcus Hollis, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped inside, his eyes immediately scanning his mother's face. He was still wearing his police uniform, his badge glinting in the fading light. He reached out, gently placing a hand on her arm. "Mom, are you okay? You look... I could tell something was wrong when I called earlier." Grace took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I'm fine, Marcus. It's just been a difficult day." She turned away, her fingers brushing against the back of her chair as she walked back to her seat. Marcus frowned, his gaze falling on the broken cane still lying across the armchair. His eyes widened, and he knelt beside his mother, his hand reaching out to touch the fractured wood. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Grace hesitated, her fingers trembling as she touched the broken cane. "It was someone in the park," she began slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "An officer. He said I shouldn't be walking alone, and he broke it. He broke my cane, Marcus." For a moment, the room was silent. Marcus stared at the cane, his jaw tightening, the muscles in his neck straining as he fought to control his emotions. His mother's cane, something so simple yet so vital, had been reduced to splinters by a man who had sworn to protect and serve. The anger that surged through him was like a tidal wave, crashing against the walls of his composure. "Who was it?" Marcus finally asked, his voice low and trembling with barely restrained rage. Grace shook her head. "No, Marcus, please. I don't want you to get involved. I know what kind of trouble this could bring you." She reached out, her hand finding his cheek, her touch gentle. "I don't want you risking your career or your safety because of me." Marcus closed his eyes, pressing his mother's hand to his face. He took a deep breath, his heart aching at the pain in her voice. "Mom, you know I can't let this go," he said quietly. "You're my mother. No one has a right to treat you like this, officer or not." Grace withdrew her hand, her fingers tightening around the broken cane. "I know, Marky, I know, but I don't want you to put yourself in danger for my sake." Marcus stood slowly, his gaze never leaving his mother's face. He could see the fear in her eyes, the worry for him, but beneath it all, he saw something else. There was a flicker of hope, a small, almost imperceptible spark that told him she wanted justice, even if she was afraid to admit it. He knelt back down, taking her hand in his. "Mom, I promise you I'll be careful. I won't let this go, but I'll do it the right way. No one should get away with this, not when it's you, not when it's anyone." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes, and this time she didn't brush them away. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against her son's, her voice a broken whisper. "Just be careful, Marcus. That's all I ask." He nodded, squeezing her hand gently before standing. He knew what he had to do, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. Confronting a fellow officer, going against the system, these were the things that made even the bravest hesitate. But this was his mother, the woman who had raised him, who had taught him to stand tall in the face of injustice. There was no choice, no hesitation in his heart. Later that night, after helping his mother settle in for the evening and making sure she had everything she needed, Marcus left her house with a sense of determination that burned within him. He needed to find answers, and he needed them fast. He knew that Officer Randy was a man who enjoyed control, a man who believed in his own authority above all else. Marcus had seen men like him before, officers who used their badge as a weapon rather than a shield. His first stop was the precinct, a building he knew better than the back of his own hand. He walked through the familiar halls, each step echoing in the quiet of the late hour. He passed by the desks of officers he'd known for years, men and women who trusted him, respected him. This investigation would test those bonds, he knew, but he couldn't let that stop him. In the records room, Marcus pulled up the patrol logs for the previous day. It didn't take long to find Randy's name, listed as patrolling Rosewood Park during the hours Grace usually took her morning walks. He clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as he stared at the screen. The confirmation felt like a punch to the gut, even though he had known what he would find. The next step was to gather evidence. He needed more than just his mother's word, more than just his suspicion. He needed witnesses, proof, something concrete that would stand up against the inevitable pushback from Randy and his supporters within the department. Marcus decided to start by visiting the park again, this time not as a casual visitor but as an investigator. He returned the next day, his eyes scanning the area for anyone who might have seen the altercation. He spotted James, the young coffee vendor who always greeted his mother warmly. Marcus approached the cart, his heart pounding as he prepared to ask the questions that might unravel everything. "Hey, James," Marcus said, his voice steady, though his eyes were sharp and searching. The young man looked up, smiling in recognition. "Hey, Officer Hollis, you're Grace's son, right? She's a wonderful lady, always so kind." Marcus nodded, his chest tightening at the mention of his mother. "Yeah, that's right. James, I need to ask you something. Yesterday, my mom was here in the park, and there was an incident. An officer, he approached her, and things went badly. Did you happen to see anything?" James's face fell, his eyes widening. He hesitated, glancing around as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "Yeah, I saw it," he said quietly. "It was awful. He broke her cane right there, and no one did anything. I wanted to, but..." He trailed off, his gaze dropping to the ground. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder. "I understand, James. I know it's hard to step in, especially when it's an officer. But anything you can tell me, anything you saw, it'll help. I need to make sure this doesn't happen again." James nodded, his expression resolute. "I recorded it. I couldn't just stand there and do nothing, so I pulled out my phone. I have a video." Marcus felt a surge of relief, a weight lifting from his chest. "Can you send it to me? It could make all the difference." James quickly retrieved his phone, his fingers shaking slightly as he tapped the screen and shared the video with Marcus. The officer watched the clip, his jaw tightening as he saw the cruelty etched in Randy's actions, The way he tore the cane from Grace's hands. The mocking smile on his face as he broke it. This was it. Proof. But as Marcus stared at the video, he knew this was only the beginning. Randy wouldn't go down easily, and neither would those who stood by him. There would be resistance, threats, even retaliation, but Marcus couldn't let that stop him. Not when it was his mother's dignity on the line, not when it was justice that demanded to be served. He left the park that day with the video safely stored on his phone. His resolve hardened. His mother had taught him to fight for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. And he would do just that, no matter the cost. The following morning, Marcus sat in his car, parked near the entrance of Rosewood Park. The faint hum of the engine was the only sound as he stared at the screen of his phone, watching the video James had recorded. He'd already replayed it countless times, analyzing every second. The sneer on Officer Randy's face, the harshness of his tone, and the snap of Grace's cane, it all filled him with a quiet, simmering rage. But this wasn't just about his emotions anymore. This was about justice, and he knew it needed to be done methodically. Taking a deep breath, Marcus exited his car and walked into the park. The air was cool, carrying the scent of dew-drenched grass and the faint aroma of coffee from James's cart. Marcus waved at the young vendor as he passed, nodding in silent thanks for the video. His goal today was clear. Gather more witnesses, more evidence, and piece together a case strong enough to stand against the weight of the department's unspoken code of loyalty. As he strolled along the gravel paths, he approached the bench under the oak tree where his mother often sat. A woman with a stroller paused nearby, rocking her child gently. Marcus recognized her from his previous visits to the park. Her name was Clara, and she was a regular like his mother. "Good morning," Marcus greeted, his tone friendly but measured. Clara looked up, smiling faintly. "Good morning, officer. Can I help you with something?" "I hope so," Marcus replied, stepping closer. "I'm Grace's son. She's here most mornings. Perhaps you've seen her?" "Oh, of course. Your mother's a lovely woman. We've chatted a few times while our paths crossed. I was so sorry to hear about what happened yesterday." Marcus's brows rose slightly. "So you were here? You saw it?" Clara hesitated, her gaze flickering to her child. "I did," she admitted softly. "I wasn't close enough to hear everything, but I saw enough. That officer, he was cruel. The way he snapped her cane like that, it was uncalled for." Marcus's jaw tightened, though he kept his voice calm. "Would you be willing to give a statement? I'm putting together evidence to ensure he's held accountable." Clara bit her lip, uncertainty flashing in her eyes. I don't want any trouble. I have a family, Officer Hollis. If people find out I spoke out against a policeman, it could make things difficult." Marcus nodded, understanding her fear. He reached into his pocket and handed her a card. "I get it, Clara. If you change your mind, call me. You'd be helping not just my mother, but everyone who could face someone like him in the future." She took the card reluctantly, tucking it into her pocket. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. As Marcus moved on, the weight of the challenge ahead settled more heavily on his shoulders. The fear Clara felt wasn't unique. It was part of the culture that allowed men like Randy to thrive. People were scared to stand up, scared to speak out. Breaking through that fear would take more than a promise of justice. It would take courage from those who had witnessed the injustice firsthand. Later, Marcus visited the park's maintenance office, where security footage from the surveillance cameras was stored. The park had only a few cameras, and their coverage wasn't perfect, but he hoped they might have caught some part of the incident. The man at the desk, an older gentleman named Frank, was reluctant to help at first. "I don't want to get involved in police business," Frank said, scratching his beard nervously. "I've been working here for 20 years, Officer Hollis. I've seen what happens when people stick their noses where they don't belong." "This isn't about sticking your nose in," Marcus countered firmly. "This is about protecting the community, about making sure this doesn't happen again. Not to my mother, not to anyone." Frank sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're a good man, Marcus. Your mother's a fine lady. All right, I'll see what I can find." Frank pulled up the footage from the previous day, scrolling through timestamps until he found the right segment. Marcus leaned over the desk, watching intently as the grainy video played out. The angle was distant, the audio non-existent, but it was clear enough. Randy's towering figure loomed over Grace, his aggressive gestures unmistakable. The moment he snapped the cane was captured in painful detail. "That's enough," Marcus said, his voice tight. "Can you save this for me? I'll need a copy." Frank nodded, his fingers moving deftly over the keyboard. "You'll have it by the end of the day. Just be careful, Marcus. You're going up against one of your own. That's not easy." Marcus nodded, his mind already racing ahead. With James's video, Clara's potential testimony, and now the security footage, he was beginning to piece together a case. But evidence alone wouldn't be enough. He knew the department well enough to predict the pushback. Randy wasn't just any officer. He had allies, people who would cover for him, dismiss the complaints, and protect their own. That night, back at his mother's house, Marcus shared the progress he'd made. Grace listened silently, her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You're doing so much, Marky," she said softly, her voice tinged with both pride and worry. "But promise me you won't lose yourself in this. I don't want to see you hurt." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "I won't, Mom, but I have to do this. For you and for everyone else who might cross paths with him." Grace nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Just be careful, son. The world isn't kind to those who try to change it." As Marcus left that night, her words echoed in his mind. The road ahead would be treacherous, but he was prepared to face it. He wasn't just fighting for his mother. He was fighting for the integrity of the badge he wore, for the community he had sworn to protect. The morning was unusually quiet in the precinct. Marcus stepped through the doors, his boots echoing against the tiled floor as he made his way to his desk. Heads turned subtly, eyes lingering on him for a moment too long. The weight of scrutiny was palpable, but he ignored it. He had work to do. The previous night had been restless. Thoughts of the video, the witness accounts, and the implications of taking action against Officer Randy churned in his mind. Marcus knew the risks, his reputation, his career, even his relationships with colleagues, but he couldn't let it deter him. His mother deserved justice, and the badge he wore demanded it. Sitting at his desk, Marcus opened the file he'd been compiling. Inside were copies of James's video, Clara's hesitant statement, and the security footage from the park. It was a solid foundation, but he knew it wasn't enough to ensure accountability. He needed to officially report the incident and present his case to the department's internal affairs unit. The moment he submitted the complaint, the ripple effects began. The captain called him into the office within an hour. Captain Reynolds was a veteran of the force, a man with decades of experience and a reputation for pragmatism. He looked at Marcus with a mixture of respect and apprehension as Marcus entered the room. "Close the door," Reynolds said, his tone heavy with unspoken tension. Marcus obeyed, standing stiffly as the captain leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. For a long moment, Reynolds said nothing, his piercing gaze fixed on Marcus. "You filed a report against Randy," Reynolds finally said, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied firmly. "I have evidence that he abused his authority and assaulted a civilian, my mother." Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temples. "Marcus, you're one of the best officers we've got. Your record is spotless. But this is a hornet's nest. You know how these things go. Filing a complaint against another officer. It's not as simple as it should be." "With all due respect, Captain, it shouldn't be complicated either," Marcus said, his voice steady but resolute. "What Randy did wasn't just unprofessional, it was criminal. If we can't hold ourselves accountable, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Reynolds leaned forward, his expression hardening. "You think I don't understand that? I've been doing this job long enough to know how fragile that trust is. But you're not just going after Randy. You're going up against the entire system that protects men like him. You'll make enemies, Marcus, powerful ones." "I'm not afraid of enemies," Marcus replied, his jaw set. "I'm afraid of what happens if we let people like Randy keep wearing the badge." Reynolds studied him for a moment longer before nodding slowly. "All right, I'll forward your complaint to Internal Affairs. But you'd better have everything in order, because once this starts, there's no going back." Marcus left the captain's office with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The first step had been taken, but the road ahead was steep and fraught with obstacles. He returned to his desk, feeling the weight of every stare from his colleagues. The precinct had always been a second home to him, a place of camaraderie and shared purpose. Now it felt alien, as though he were walking a tightrope above a pit of vipers. It didn't take long for the backlash to begin. Randy, of course, had been informed of the complaint. He cornered Marcus in the locker room that evening, his face red with anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Hollis?" Randy spat, stepping into Marcus's space. "You think you're some kind of hero going after me? You've got no idea what you're messing with." Marcus stood his ground, his expression calm but unyielding. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Randy. I'm holding you accountable for what you did to my mother." Randy sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Your mother? That blind old bat? She's got no business wandering around alone. I was doing her a favor." Marcus's fist clenched at his side, but he forced himself to stay composed. "Breaking her cane, humiliating her in public, that's what you call a favor? You're a disgrace to the badge, Randy." Randy leaned closer, his voice low and threatening. "You're making a big mistake, Hollis. You think the department's going to back you up? Think again. You're alone in this." Marcus met his gaze evenly. "We'll see." The confrontation ended with Randy storming out, his threats hanging heavy in the air. Marcus knew Randy was right about one thing: he wouldn't have many allies in the department. The culture of silence and loyalty among officers was deeply ingrained, and challenging it was like swimming against a riptide. The following days were a whirlwind of tension and escalating pressure. Marcus received veiled warnings from colleagues, subtle reminders to think about his career and let it go. Anonymous notes appeared on his desk, calling him a traitor. His car tires were slashed one evening after a late shift. Each incident only fueled his resolve, even as the stress began to take its toll. At home, Grace noticed the strain on her son. He visited her every evening, updating her on the progress of the case. She listened quietly, her hands often folded tightly in her lap. One night, After Marcus recounted the latest threat he'd received, she reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "Marky," she said softly, her voice trembling, "you don't have to do this. You've done so much already. I don't want to see you hurt." Marcus covered her hand with his expression gentle but firm. "Mom, I can't stop now. If I back down, it'll just keep happening. To you, to others. We deserve better." Grace nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Just promise me you'll be careful. The world doesn't always reward the good." Marcus smiled faintly, squeezing her hand. "I'll be careful, Mom, I promise." The next day, Marcus received a summons to meet with Internal Affairs. He walked into the sterile, windowless office with his head held high, his file of evidence clutched tightly in his hand. Across the table sat two investigators, their expressions unreadable. "Officer Hollis," one of them began, "we've reviewed your complaint and the materials you've submitted. It's a strong case, but you understand the implications of pursuing this, don't you?" "I understand," Marcus replied, "but I stand by my complaint. Randy's actions were unacceptable, and they reflect poorly on all of us who wear the badge." The investigators exchanged a glance before nodding. "We'll proceed with a formal inquiry. You'll be notified of the next steps." As Marcus left the office, a wave of exhaustion washed over him. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had taken another step toward justice, and no matter how steep the cost, he was prepared to see it through. The inquiry moved faster than Marcus had anticipated. Internal Affairs had begun their investigation, summoning officers for interviews and collecting more evidence. The tension within the precinct was palpable. An invisible line seemed to divide those who supported Marcus, albeit silently, and those who saw his actions as a betrayal. Every day, Marcus walked into the precinct, feeling the unspoken hostility from some of his colleagues and the furtive, supportive nods from others. It was a strange and uncomfortable existence, one that left Marcus more isolated than he had ever been. Officer Randy, on the other hand, had grown more erratic. The pressure of the investigation seemed to affect him visibly. His temper was shorter, his demeanor angrier. He spent his shifts with a scowl permanently etched on his face, and Marcus could feel the hatred radiating from him whenever they passed in the hallways. Randy wasn't going to go down quietly. Marcus knew that much. It was a late afternoon when Marcus was called into the conference room. The room was small, with plain white walls and a table in the center where the two Internal Affairs investigators sat waiting. They motioned for him to sit. Marcus took a seat, placing his hands on the table, his fingers laced tightly. "Officer Hollis," Investigator Greer began, "we've gathered sufficient evidence against Officer Randy, thanks in large part to your efforts and the witnesses you were able to secure." Marcus's heart thudded in his chest, a mixture of relief and tension. What happens now? "We will be proceeding with formal charges against Randy for misconduct, abuse of authority, and assault," Investigator Greer said. "The evidence is overwhelming, and his behavior during our interviews has only reinforced our findings. This will likely lead to his suspension and possibly his termination." Marcus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, the feeling of vindication swelling within him. He thought of his mother, how vulnerable she had looked holding the broken pieces of her cane, and how she had urged him to be careful. This was for her. Every bit of it was for her. But Greer wasn't done. She leaned forward, her gaze serious. "However, Marcus, you should be prepared for backlash. We have reason to believe Randy won't go down without a fight. He's been making threats, both direct and veiled, against those who've testified and anyone involved in the investigation. Marcus frowned, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. What kind of threats? Nothing specific, but he's made it clear that he won't be held accountable without trying to drag others down with him, Greer said. We're advising you to be vigilant, especially given your personal connection to the case. People like Randy. When they feel cornered, they're capable of anything. Marcus nodded, his jaw set in determination. He wasn't surprised, but the warning added a sense of urgency to his mission. He needed to make sure not only that Randy was held accountable, but also that his mother remained safe through it all. That evening, Marcus went to visit his mother, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Grace welcomed him with a warm smile, her hands outstretched to find his. As they sat in the living room, he recounted the latest news, the progress of the case, the formal charges, the risks that remained. Grace listened quietly, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. "You've done so much, Marky," she said softly, her voice trembling. "But you must be careful. A cornered man like Randy is dangerous." "I know, Mom," Marcus replied, his voice firm, "but I need you to trust me. We're almost there, and once this is over, he won't be able to hurt anyone again." Grace reached out, her fingers brushing against his cheek. "I trust you, my boy. I always have. Just promise me you'll stay safe." Marcus nodded, covering her hand with his. "I promise." But the storm wasn't over yet. A few days later, as Marcus was getting ready to leave for his shift, his phone buzzed with a message, a number he didn't recognize. The message read, "Think you're untouchable, Hollis. Think again." Marcus stared at the screen, his gut clenching. He knew immediately who it was. Randy was trying to intimidate him, to rattle him enough to make him back down. But Marcus was beyond fear now. He had come too far to turn back. That evening, as he returned home from his shift, Marcus noticed a car parked across the street from his house. The silhouette of a man was visible through the windshield, the faint glow of a cigarette illuminating his face. Marcus's instincts kicked in, and he reached for his radio, calling in backup. The car sped off as soon as he began walking toward it, the tires screeching in the quiet neighborhood. It was a stark reminder of the danger he faced, but it also fueled his determination. He couldn't allow himself to be intimidated, not when so much was at stake. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the precinct to find it buzzing with activity. Word had spread. Randy had been officially suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of shock, anger, and relief. Marcus could see the divided expressions, some officers giving him approving nods, others scowling as he walked past. Later that day, Marcus was scheduled to testify in a preliminary hearing for Randy's disciplinary action. As he waited outside the hearing room, he could hear raised voices inside, Randy's shouting in anger, his lawyer trying to calm him down. The door opened, and Randy emerged, his face flushed, his eyes blazing with fury. He saw Marcus, and for a moment, the two locked eyes. Randy stalked toward him, his posture aggressive, his fist clenched. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You're nothing, Hollis. You're a traitor, and you'll get what's coming to you." Marcus stood his ground, meeting Randy's gaze without flinching. "I'm doing my job, Randy. You broke the law, and now you're facing the consequences. That's how it works." Randy laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "You think this is over? You're delusional. I've got people in my corner, people who aren't afraid to do what it takes to keep men like you in line." Marcus didn't respond, watching as Randy stormed out of the hallway, his lawyer trailing behind him, looking frazzled. He knew Randy wouldn't go quietly, but Marcus also knew that he wasn't alone. The evidence was overwhelming, and with internal affairs backing him, Randy's time as an officer was running out. The hearing itself was tense, but Marcus testified with clarity and confidence. He described what his mother had endured, presenting the video footage, witness statements, and security camera recordings. The room was silent as he spoke, the gravity of Randy's actions sinking in. When Marcus finished, he could see the expressions of the panel: anger, disbelief, and, most importantly, a determination to act. By the end of the hearing, the decision was made. Randy was officially suspended without pay, pending criminal charges. It was a significant victory, but Marcus knew it was only the beginning of the legal process. There would be more hearings, more battles ahead. But for now, Randy was stripped of his badge, his power to hurt others taken away. That night, Marcus returned to his mother's house, feeling both exhausted and relieved. Grace welcomed him in, her arms wrapping around him in a tight embrace. "Marky, you did it," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "You stood up for what was right. I'm so proud of you." Marcus hugged her back, his eyes closing as he let out a deep breath. "It's not over yet, Mom, but we've taken a big step. He won't be able to hurt anyone else now." Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face. "That's all I ever wanted. For you, for me, for everyone he's hurt." They sat together that night, the warmth of their shared victory filling the room. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a sense of hope, a belief that justice, though slow and costly, was possible. Randy had fallen, and the system that protected him had been shaken. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start. And for Marcus and Grace, that was enough to keep fighting. The sun was bright on the morning Marcus finally felt he could breathe again. The past weeks had been an emotional roller coaster, marked by hearings, interviews, and countless sleepless nights. The decision to suspend Randy, to strip him of his badge, had been a monumental step. But Marcus knew that it had come at a cost. The department was still divided, and whispers followed him wherever he went. Some saw him as a hero, others as a traitor who had turned against his own. But today, Marcus wasn't thinking about the department, or even Randy. Today was about his mother, about reclaiming a piece of what had been taken from her. He'd picked up a new cane for her, a special one he had ordered, crafted with a sturdier handle and a small engraved plate that bore the words, "To my strength." He held it gently, feeling the weight of the polished wood in his hands, the meaning behind each word etched into the metal. He knocked softly on his mother's door, the familiar sound of her voice calling out for him to enter. Grace was sitting in her favorite armchair, the morning light spilling through the window, casting a warm glow across the room. She turned her head as he walked in, her face brightening at the sound of his footsteps. "Marky, is that you?" she asked, her smile soft and welcoming. Marcus approached her, a warmth filling his chest at her voice. "It's me, Mom. I've got something for you." Grace reached out, her hands searching for his. Marcus gently took her hand and placed the cane into it, guiding her fingers along its length. She gasped softly, her expression one of surprise and emotion. It's beautiful," she whispered, her fingers tracing the smooth wood, the engraved words catching under her fingertips. "What does it say?" Marcus knelt beside her, his voice thick with emotion. It says to my strength, Mom, because that's what you are to me. You're the strongest person I know, and I wanted you to have something that reflects that. Tears welled up in Grace's eyes, and she blinked them back, her lips trembling as she smiled. Oh, Marky, you didn't have to do this. Yes, I did, Marcus replied, his voice firm. After everything that's happened, I wanted to give you back something of what was taken. You deserve this, and so much more. Grace nodded, her hands gripping the cane tightly. She took a deep breath, her voice wavering as she spoke. I'm so proud of you, Marcus. What you did, it took courage. Not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been afraid. You've shown them that we don't have to be silent, that we can stand up to people like Randy. Marcus looked down, his eyes stinging with tears. I just wanted to do what was right, Mom. For you, for everyone. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the only way. Grace reached out, cupping his face in her hand, her touch gentle. You've always been my boy. My strong, brave boy. And today, you've proven that more than ever. They sat together in the silence of the room, the warmth of their shared pride and love filling the space between them. It was a moment of peace, a respite from the storm that had consumed their lives for so long. After a few minutes, Marcus helped his mother up, steadying her as she took hold of the new cane. She held it with confidence, her shoulders straightening as she tapped it gently against the floor, feeling its weight and balance. There was a quiet determination in her movements, a sense of renewed strength that Marcus could feel radiating from her. Let's go for a walk, Marky, Grace said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. It's been too long since I felt the park under my feet. Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with love for his mother. Of course, Mom, let's go. The park was just as Grace remembered it, the familiar scents and sounds wrapping around her like an old friend. The air was cool, the scent of autumn leaves mixing with the earthy aroma of the grass. The soft rustle of the wind through the branches was like a gentle whisper, a reminder of the peace she had always found in this place. As they walked, Grace felt the smooth handle of the cane in her hand, a symbol of her resilience. It was more than just a tool. It was a reminder that she had overcome, that she had faced the darkness and emerged on the other side with her dignity intact. They reached the old oak tree, the one where she had always rested, and Marcus guided her to the bench. She settled down, her hands resting on the cane as she tilted her head up, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. It's beautiful today, she said softly, her voice filled with contentment. I can hear the children playing, the birds singing. It feels like everything is as it should be. Marcus sat beside her, his gaze drifting across the park. He could see people enjoying their day, families having picnics, children chasing each other, joggers making their way along the paths. It was a scene of normalcy, of peace, and it filled him with a sense of accomplishment. You're right, Mom, he said, his voice quiet. Everything feels right today. Grace turned her head toward him, her smile radiant. Thank you for bringing me back here, Marky. I was afraid I'd lost this place. You could never lose it, Mom, Marcus replied, his heart swelling with emotion. This is your place. No one can take that from you. They sat in comfortable silence, the world around them moving at its own gentle pace. The sound of a vendor selling coffee reached their ears, and Marcus smiled, remembering James, the young man who had been one of the first to help. He stood, giving his mother's shoulder a gentle squeeze. I'm going to grab us some coffee. Sit tight, Mom. Grace nodded, her smile warm. I'll be right here, Marky. As Marcus walked toward the cart, he spotted James, who gave him a wide smile as he approached. "Officer Hollis," James greeted, his voice cheerful. "It's good to see you again." "You too, James," Marcus replied, returning the smile. "I just wanted to say thanks for everything. You made a real difference." James's smile softened, and he nodded. "Your mom deserved better. I'm just glad I could help." Marcus ordered 2 coffees and made his way back to the bench where his mother sat, her head tilted up as she listened to the sounds of the park. He handed her the cup, and she took it gratefully, her fingers brushing against his. "Thank you, Marky," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "For everything." They sipped their coffee, the warmth spreading through them, the silence between them filled with a sense of peace and resolution. Grace knew that life would never be without its challenges, that the world would always have people like Randy, people who thrived on power, who sought to control and demean. But she also knew that there were people like Marcus, people who stood for justice, who refused to let others be diminished. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden light across the park, Marcus turned to his mother. "Ready to head home, Mom?" Grace smiled, her grip on her cane firm as she stood. "Yes, Marky. Let's go home." They walked side by side, the path familiar beneath their feet, the air cool and comforting. And, as they made their way out of the park, Grace felt a sense of closure, a sense of strength that she hadn't felt in a long time. She was no longer the woman whose cane had been broken, whose dignity had been shattered. She was Grace Hollis, resilient, unyielding, and proud. And with her son by her side, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Thank you for watching to the end. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends, because each of us can find something important in these stories. We also invite you to watch our other videos. There are many more to come.